PM?
Hi, is this audio okay or is it a bit echoey? Okay, all right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Within the pathway of victory for Gulf team today is essentially to explain to you why it is in the interest of the Central Asian states and why it is most strategic for them to join and be the membership of this particular union at the end of the day. To first prove this, we need to illustrate to you what the current situation of the Central Asian states that are not part of this membership look like. We think they look like, number one, having very underdeveloped economies and having very stagnant tourism and also various aspects of the economic industries. This is true because, number one, geographically, these states are landlocked. They have zero to no access to any form of watercourse. This means that a lot of their trade becomes very restricted to only bilateral counterparts towards the states that are peripheral around them. Secondly, because of their underdeveloped state, because of their inability to garner as much of the internal investments from the rare minerals, from the natural gas, because of a lack of technology. This means there's lesser incentives for other international states to even want to come forward to engage with bilateral trade with them to begin with. Next, I think it's also important to understand that geographically, these states are caught in between two major superpowers. First, with China, and secondly, with Russia. This is important context because it's likely to prove to you why it is also with the interest of them to work with Russia within this particular bloc. First, with China, number one, historically and culturally, they are completely different with each other. This necessarily means it is unclear why China, therefore, would engage with bilateral trade with them or even want to accept them within China's bloc, which is BRICS. Because of the cultural and historical differences, there necessarily becomes a stifle of kind of this meaningful discussion that can therefore happen on their side. Within the comparative of them, therefore, joining this union with Russia and other member states becomes much more viable and easier because, number one, cultural and historically, they are largely the same, but also they speak almost the same language. This means that any form of alternatives, such as engaging with any other international states that is beyond their reach, or even engaging with a closest superpower apart from Russia, which is China, generally does not exist. And therefore, the only and best alternative is just to join this union. Now, I want to explain to you what are the positives of just engaging with this, but entering within this particular bloc. Note that because of the absence of the water ports, when you enter this bloc, you get to tap into the access of these ports that these other states within this union have. Okay. This means you'll get to have the benefit of increase of labor routes, to increase your trade, and to allow yourself to mobilize your human capital to areas where you're never able to do so to begin with. We think that this is particularly important because this is naturally a net good to increase your employment opportunities, a net good to increase your trading market and things like that. Secondly, we think it's also on the impact of the escalation of economic development and tapping into technologies and tapping into information that you otherwise would not be able to have. Because when you have things like the liberalization of trade, when you have things like moving your resources around, we think this generate a huge chunk of return of investment that you otherwise would not have if you were to stay isolated as a state that is out Russia or outside of this union. Next, we see that within the info slide that there is a trajectory towards wanting to have a common currency within this bloc as well. Why would this be in favor of this particular? Why would this be in favor of those three states? Why? Because we think that having a currency, having a strong currency is linked to having a good buying power. Note that if the purchasing power of these Central Asian states in the status quo is already weak, we think that therefore it is generally already a net good for you to join a bloc in which they have a trajectory and have current plans to want to have a common currency. We think that the common currency largely is actually more stable, even if we cannot prove for certainty that it will be a stronger currency compared to the other currencies that exist outside of this region. We think that internally within these states in the union itself, a common currency allows for easier trade. A common currency allows for better internal trade to begin with. This is already also a net good compared to the current stagnant situation that these Central Asian states have. Before I move on to explain the situation of Russia, I'll take on to your light.
What products do mineral-rich countries like Turkmenistan sell to other mineral-rich countries in this union that become profitable for their own development?
I think that as long they not only just have rare minerals within these kind of states, but we think they also have other resources such as natural gas that in return, when they sell to these kinds of internal states, they can generate much kind of profit to begin with. We think that sure, they may lose out when it comes to comparative advantage on an international scale, but we think that to judge this debate, you must do on an idea of a comparative. If you really want to sell your things on a bilateral way, we think significantly you already lose out. As opposed to if you were to engage in trades via a block, we think people are more likely to therefore engage with you as a block as opposed as a singular state. Next, I want to now answer why is it that Russia has this incentive to accept you meaningfully, and there won't be any form of harms of Russia's power play within this particular union. We think that it's because, number one, Russia is already desperate for a lot of these kinds of resources because of the fact that they're already losing a lot of these resources because of the current war and because they're trying to recuperate from the war itself. Also, secondarily, because of a current international condemnation towards Russia, Russia is generally very desperate in trying to gather allies. This means that therefore, Russia is likely to welcome you with open arms as opposed to be very reluctant and hesitant to wanting to accept you within the union in itself. And next, because Russia has generally have lesser reliance on Europe, especially because of NATO and things like that, Russia is generally more than welcome to want to have you within the union in itself. What does this mean, therefore? When you have a block versus block trade versus a bilateral trade, we think there is something that is important because we have proven to you that bilateral trades generally don't work because, number one, you are a landlocked country who is fundamentally inaccessible for you to engage with other trades unless you're some form of superpower or at least a developed country enough for people want to actually trade with you. Versus if you were to engage in trades via a block, this is important because you're engaging with other blocks, therefore, as a whole. Therefore, you're going to tap into the networks and allies of the other members. This means that other countries within the union can also then tell you what are specific countries that want to trade with them and therefore allocate a lot of these kinds of network and alliances to you. This means that you also get to tap into trading with other peripheral blocks as well, further expanding your trade market and further allowing your country to develop economically at the end of the day.
Thanks for that speech, Leader of Op.
Am I seeable and am I audible? Great. Okay. Starting 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. What do we prefer on our side? 1, you can pursue individual deals with specific members of the union. For example, if you want to trade deals specifically with Azerbaijan, that's perfectly fine. But secondly, you will opt into trade deals and unions with people like the EU, like the US, and like India. We'll point out why there's a mutually exclusive mechanism later on in the speech. The first thing you want to do is to throw out this entire thing on you just cannot trade with the EU due to some lack of ports. The first thing that they use to prove this is just to say that there are cultural differences, but obviously this doesn't matter if you're talking about economic trade deals. Like for individuals, they don't care where the rare earths really come from as long as it flows as a thing, right? So I'm not so sure why this is the largest harm. But the second thing that they say is that geographically it's impossible because you're landlocked. So guys, this is a map of like Central Asia. The thing is, this is where the countries are. This is China. That's where they can trade. This is India. This is also where they can trade. And in many cases, they can go through other land routes, for example, through the Caspian Sea to be able to access Europe because there are existing land routes that exist from Turkmenistan to Turkey and going into the European Union. So I don't think that that's the largest harm insofar as they do have some extent of access, insofar as we can still access, for example, the Caspian Sea and some extent of the block that's talked about within the motion, be able to have collaboration to be able to transfer goods between different parts of the world. So yeah. the first thing I'm going to run is just that you have a dramatic loss of freedom, and that's very, very important for the government insofar as your citizens really want freedom in this specific way. The first thing I wanted to frame in is why they don't like Russia. There are 4 reasons. One, because of their history with the USSR. They've spent decades under totalitarian rule, under communist rule, under those individuals. They've seen the genocides of Russians against other Central Asian states existed for years on end. And insofar as that's the case, they're hugely suspicious of this move. Secondly, because of the way that their national identity was constructed. In the wake of the USSR's fall, they needed to make an independent national identity away from the Russians. They had to emphasize specifically an independent history against Russia, insofar as they want to hedge against the initial Russian state's aggression against them, and they dramatically wanted to create legitimacy for themselves as individual rulers, and that means that they need to, create a unique Uzbek or unique Kazakh identity. The third thing to point out is what's unique about these specific Central Asian states, which is that they were the ones farthest away from Russia in terms of their geographic location vis-a-vis the rest of Central Asia, right? And what that uniquely meant is that they had the least amount of Russian cultural influence because they were far away from the core of Moscow, and they just didn't receive that many immigrants. And that probably means that there's less of the effects of being pro-Russia or being influenced by a Russian minority as what happened for many other Central Asian states, for example, Kazakhstan. But the last thing to point out is obviously the fact they just didn't join the group. This shows that they already had a preference in the past to not opt into anything that was pro-Russia in general. And it means that they have a general preference against this sort of thing. The next part of this argument is just to point out what they lose in government and why this makes a huge amount of individuals panic on their side. One, they will lose legal independence. The regulations within this specific trade bloc to not trade with individuals in the West, to, for example, hand over Russian nationals who do crime towards Russia instead of allowing them to be prosecuted on your own courts. And because of history, you feel like this is really, really bad. This is, again, imperialism. This is a loss of your identity that you built up over the last 30 years because of the simple fact that they're able to flex their muscles over you by virtue of you being in the same group as them. Secondly, economic interdependence. It's threats to develop a central currency that removes your ability to have a fiscal policy which is independent. The inability to protect your own industry through unique tariffs that are only accessible outside of this group. This matters deeply to the individual. Insofar as they know that Russia probably doesn't have their best interests in their hearts, insofar as they don't want to starve, and insofar as they want to create a level of independence vis-a-vis Russia, it's very likely people are going to be pissed at this. But the last bit, demographic interdependence, right? It's the threat of the possibility of Russian immigrants coming into your city, stealing your jobs. And the harm of this is that many individuals in these cities are suspicious because Russians have been able to use this as a tactic in the past to justify their own invasions in the past under the guise of protecting their own unique minorities. And obviously these countries don't want to have to go to the same thing that Ukraine had to go through insofar as that was the casus belli they used. The consequences of this argument are simple. One, if you try to do this, people riot. There's a huge amount of chaos from large amounts of both opposition and general moderate workers who believe that this is a really, really bad thing, which in itself throws the country into chaos insofar as likely to paralyze large amounts of your industry, paralyze large amounts of your politics. And it means that it's an immediate harm to you. But secondly, it's not in the national interest, even if it's about economic considerations. Clearly, there are other considerations like matter, oftentimes legal considerations, conditions of culture, which for many individuals are a trade-off that they're willing to take off insofar as they knew that the economic history of Russia hasn't been the best, and they'd rather have their own unique ability to determine for themselves what their culture is and who they are, and insofar as their cultural considerations and their national considerations are probably deeper than economic ones. Second, you lose out on a lot of economic benefits. The first thing I actually want to prove under this is what you will lose if you do not opt into the EU and the US comparative. The first thing to point out is that it's mutually exclusive due to 2 reasons. One, there are automatic legal sanctions against individuals that join the bloc, and it means that you already lose out on billions of dollars on trade on their side of the house when you opt into this bloc due to the fact that the EU and the US decided to sanction people in this bloc after the Ukraine war. Secondly, because of the fact that they don't even want to try to invest into you, insofar as they might view you as a lost cause and an individual that they shouldn't try to sway towards their side of the general Cold War. And it means that it's unlikely that they're going to really care. The thing I want to point out is that it's far more likely that they pay a lot for the goods that were described this motion, right? The first reason is because of a perception of competition. Because you don't join any one particular group automatically, you have the perception that they will still need to compete against Russia, and they preemptively create bigger bids compared to on their side where Russia just trusts that they're, basically your bitch. And that means that they're going to already underpay for your goods and have the leverage to do so. The second thing to point out is the EU and the US, obviously sources, they need rare earths to opt into things such as an EV race with China. They desperately need these natural resources because they don't have these sorts of things. What I'd point out is the comparative. where the advantages of the Union are just very, very small. And that's for a few reasons. One, because all of the countries in the Union develop the same types of goods as you, rare earths, similar agricultural goods. That means that you're not getting anything really desperately cheaper, right? That means that you're not having a comparative advantage in trade. It just means that you basically have the incentive to only undercut the price of those goods because you're just trading the same goods amongst one another. So the only competition is based on price, not on the type of good that you're having to sell. And that means that you get no real advantage out of it except for a devaluation of your minerals. But suddenly, you're pushed into bad deals. The Russians are able to threaten their trade partners a lot because of the Union as a requirement, demanding that you don't go towards outside customers, because the fact that Russia has a large amount of leverage within it, and so they're the most powerful ones. That broadly means things such as, one, being forced to devalue your minerals, not sell it to foreigners, bad price to these things, and it being automatically transported to Russia, where two, they oftentimes have incentives to just develop those into their own forms of cheap goods and not allow you to develop your own heavy industry, for example, by, for example, forcing you to just accept their own cheap finished goods. And that broadly means that you're not able to do things such as protect your own industry, to take tariffs to be able to protect these individuals, which means that you have a greater amount of dependence on the Russian state, which is often something that you don't want in general.
Thanks for that speech, DPM.
All right, hi, just give me 1 second. Okay, hi, am I audible and visible? Okay, cool. I'll take a POI 5 minutes, 6 minutes onward. Please do not badger me prior to the 5th minute. Unless it's a reading. Verbally, but I'm not reading chat. Starting in 3, 2, panel, showing maps isn't the clear-cut way to win around. I think it's important to understand the geopolitical nature of those things. Sure, on a map, I can show you the distance between one area and another, but it doesn't explain to you why necessarily certain reasons of geopolitical reasons exist, i.e., the reason why you can't really navigate towards the left, or why necessarily you don't have naval routes to access a lot of trade, and because naval routes is the primary methods of trading, is inherently problematic. Second thing then, and this immediately deals with what opposition tries to push. Opposition says the problem here is that it's a dramatic loss of freedom, it's bad because it challenges your legitimacy as a state. I think the first thing I implore you to do is to read the info slide and the motion. Panel, this is an economic union. This is not the same as a political union where you talk about EU, where they have a shared Congress, etc., right? The reality is in a shared economic union is that a large chunk of how you operate are through trade, not immediately taking away legitimacy of your state or taking away or condemnation against how you work as a nation. By virtue of that, it's completely different as to what the opposition tries to portray. It's not a loss of independence or autonomy, it's necessarily engaging in trade, engaging in bigger free trade agreements. Why then Eunsi's material still stands the response was insufficient? The understanding here is simple. The large chunk of the problem, especially when you frame Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, is to understand the landlord nature of those places, number one. Number two, the current economic state of those places. Number three, what type of minerals do they have, or what type of resources do they have to export, and necessarily why they're always not seen as a viable option. This answer can be answered in one very simple premise, that they don't have access to freshwater ports, the ability for them to have naval routes, because oftentimes in engaging with bilateral trades, it's through those very routes that matter. If you're talking about land routes, however, the question then becomes, why isn't there more viable alternatives? And this is the very reason why China doesn't really care about those regions. China cares more about expanding westwards and trying to form the Belt Road Index, even though it's quite close to China, just like the map shows to you. The reality then is that the ability for them to hop on into a block allows for them to push into multiple different expansions when it comes to trade and the liberalization of their items. The push then was this idea, how do they make profits within the POI? I think it's simple. The way in which trade works isn't as stupid as, oh, you give all your minerals and we pay you nothing because we're in an economic trade. The reality is the lived experiences that they have right now is to force themselves to either A, choose economic stagnation, or B, find an ally in the face of being sandwiched between two superpowers. They have to choose, and it's pertinent to their existence. If they don't choose either China or Russia, that's more likely than not them losing out to any and all like benefits or growth or development within those nations. They're stuck landlocked, they don't get any growth. This is inherently bad. Why then is the choice Russia, and why then this membership is more likely to formulate the moment we explain to you the cultural history that Russia has? It's correct that they were a part of the USSR, but it's exactly the reason as to why those cultural ties aren't as far off when we talk about the difference between China and Russia. This is the reason why if you propose to be in an economic union with China, China's probably like, what do you provide to me? But Russia, being its multiple examples of its position, is more likely to take you because of your values towards them. What are the values that you want to talk about here? I think it's simple. It's number one, the source of minerals and resources, even though it may be multiple and same between multiple states, but it's a coagulation of those goods that they are able to sell as a block. That means that they're able to package those items as a block. By virtue of that, you're able to move your goods. Alternatives don't really, like, you become the alternative as opposed to non-viable alternatives. But secondly, is to understand necessarily the worker movements that matter. This is extremely important because this talks about when you're able to move your workers and your civilians across the economic union is when they're also able to move, their workers are also able to move towards your union and build up infrastructure and build up processing plants that otherwise you would never have had if you chose to be isolationist and you chose to be isolated because necessarily nobody wants to bilaterally trade with you. I'll deal with a pernicious problem coming out from opposition, which is the idea of Russian power dynamics and necessarily why this Russian power dynamics is bad. I think it's to understand the partnerships that exist and why it's also a collective good. Why this thus means that the collective prosperity is something that's inherent and the target of this union in itself. This means that in order for the union to succeed, it requires every member to also grow forward. The existence of this very principle pushes the three countries to necessarily also gain a portion of the pie when it comes to prosperity. This means that when your partners are doing well, you are able to do well as well. The power dynamics don't really shift to a loser or oppressor and oppressed within those natures because oftentimes it's symbiotic. Sure, go.
So now the other question is, why is this union going to be good if Russia's currency is currently at shit? The other countries that you have no clear competitive advantage. It's unclear to me why even selling things as a bloc strongly benefits these individuals.
Because it's very simple. Your currency is shittier. The reality is that the Russian rubles, even though it's horrible, is still something that has a potential to go back and recuperate. The reality is Russia is a market and an entity has always been significant historically and geopolitically. This means that even how bad they are, they're still better off than you. For those very reasons, it's very clear how then this improves your situation. But lastly, I think this is a minor part of this debate, which still matters, is to talk about diffusion of tensions when you engage in an economic partnership, which is the borders commissions that do exist between those multiple different start countries, right? The reality is, the moment where you're engaged in a partnership, it's more likely than not you choose to sidestep those very tensions. It's more likely than not you try to find resolutions in pursuit of better relationships amongst one another. In that process is where we necessarily see the fostering of better relationships between those countries and a reduction of any and all borders commissions. In conclusion, what is the point of my speech? My speech is very simple, that the idea is that the prosperity of those three nations can only come into play when they choose a side. The remaining stagnant is a death sentence. Government opposition's burden here is to explain the alternative to this. The alternative cannot be EU or US, noting that they don't care about you anyway.
Thanks for that speech, DLO.
Be wise to shot. Three things I'm going to do in this speech. The first is just to explain why a lot of their economic benefits and development is not going to be evident in this debate. The second is to explain why our kinds of economic development are better in terms of the sovereignty that we get. But lastly is to explain why exactly things like, for example, fiscal independence is the most important aspect in this debate. First and foremost, on their benefits on economic and development. I want to note that this specific clash is important because insofar as this comprises majority of their claims, if I rebut all of them, then it's important to show that we are able to develop far more. I think the first response I have for this is that generally the allies that you do align with, especially Russia, are quite unreliable. To the same frame that they have, that they are desperate, that these are irrational actors. But even if you ignore this main frame and believe their frame that, like, Putin will be better because he's so desperate, we think that the state of their economy is objective in showing that they will be quite unreliable. You see this in firstly, how there's just not a lot of resources or capital for Russia to do things like input enough development, or, for example, have enough capital to trade. You see this, for example, in the depletion of resources that they have that are used for the militia, or they often have less manpower in factories because of the fact that there's mass immigration, or things that just the immense tariffs that are placed on them. So this is already independent of attitude, which is their only mechanism for that aspect. But the second, it's just I want to note that they can't just claim that the Russian currency is just the best. I want to note that there's still kinds of instability within the currency that make it not so sustainable for these specific countries. So this responds to their strong currency or good buying power argument. Notably, a lot of the main markets and financial institutions within the world undervalue the Russian currency, which is likely to be the common courtesy of this specific union, due to the fact that it is at high risk. That a lot of times it is not used in big markets like the EU, like the US, because they don't think it's a sustainable way to input into their own kinds of development or firms, for example, because of the fact that there's an immense distrust or tariffs. But then let's look at the two situations, right? And let's kind of be engaging if it's like a shittier currency or a better currency. Let's assume that, like, firstly, that the Russian currency is like a lesser value than yours. What this does is that it floods your specific economy with cheap goods, which makes it harder for you as an individual to compete. But even if, for example, it is a better, and they have a better state right now of your economy, regardless of the currency, they can do things like buy your goods and labor for cheap. And plus, you don't get the benefits of buying power to begin with. But the second response I'm going to have is just why exactly it's bad for your economy. Why exactly is the employment and business that they acquire bad on their side? So they try to say things like, oh, it's good for employment, all of these things. One, it's likely that a lot of your institutions for employment and for like your jobs, for example, will be flooded by Russians. This is likely for three main reasons. The first is that this is just part of the mass immigration that is happening out of Russia because of the instability of the war. But two, companies usually have a bias for more prestigious graduates from Russia. So if it is true that they're going to have a free movement of labor, of resources, the people from Russia who go into your companies will likely be far more employed than the locals are. But the third is just also just the local bias and just the fear of making Russians mad if they don't treat Russians properly, especially if they can just remove them out of the bloc, for example, or reduce a lot of their economic benefits. What are the harms for this? The first is that it already exacerbates the current ethnic tensions, like the history of the USSR and the general historical context that you have. But second, it also creates more modern tensions, like the fact that you're literally taking away jobs from the locals, especially things like high-paying jobs in MNCs, where they probably will hire these Russians far more. But the third is just the ROI is just not as good, guys. So even if you, for example, the governments have already invested in the education of locals, but the local jobs aren't being taken by the locals. So especially when these individuals who are then unemployed can't input money back into the economy over, for example, Russians who enter the economy but will probably bring back their money to their family or just not pay taxes to that specific country, which makes it far more harmful. Why then, on the second issue, is our economic development far better in order for us to win this claim? The first and foremost is just our mechanism, the fact that we still have individual individual deals with countries from the bloc. So let's assume their best case, right, where they are able to have some amount of good economic stability. This is just not exclusive within the round, because states are not states within that union are not prevented from trading with other states, which means that you can still probably get the benefits of trade, even if, for example, it's not to the same extent. You're still able to get things like the cheaper goods without, for example, compromising your economic sovereignty. But the second is that you will get a far better competitive advantage from EU or US investment, because notably the EU or the US won't want to touch other blocks that are touched by Russia. But if you prove yourself to be a strong ally within the Central Asia Union and prove yourself that you are not as influenced by Russia, means that they're probably more likely to invest with you, and that's the competitive advantage that you have. But the third is just in terms of China. I don't think it's true that you can't trade with China because of cultural differences. Guys, they literally trade with Africa. They literally trade with Southeast Asia. I just don't see why this is exclusive. The deals are so harmful because the resources in of itself are similar to yours, like the minerals, oil, etc. They try to say at DPM that you can just package the items as a block and sell it even better. But if so many countries, and if it's true that so many countries want to buy your minerals anyway, then it's just not exclusive the demand that you're going to get. You're still probably able to sell it better because you can still have it as cheaper than the resources that come from Russia, because of the fact that you're operating as an individual. But secondly, if you do sell as a block, it doesn't mean that you're going to get the full profits, guys. You have to divide it amongst the block, and you have to note that a lot of these profits will probably go to Russia because they have for example, necessary refining machines or the general extracting machines, for example, which means that a lot of your profit, even if, for example, it comes from your resources, will go to them. Lastly, then, is just talk about economic sovereignty and fiscal independence. I want to note that they lose fiscal independence on their side because they want to say that, oh, you want to use Russia and make it stabilize the Russian ruble. But it's not a stable currency because of the random war shocks, because of the fact that they're reliant on natural resources, because the currency goes up and down randomly depending on the price of oil. But second, it's better to have your own economic policy. And this also responds to their currency shittier argument, because sometimes you want to devalue it to export more finished goods. Russia will not allow it because you have different economic policies, at least on our side. When there are shifts in employment, when there are shifts in terms of your own environment, you're able to meaningfully adjust, as opposed to your side where you're always encompassed by Russia. This means that on our side, we have three main benefits. The first is that we're able to have things like better board, what if they have economic union? They try to say that the economic union is not political. But I want to know that free goods or movement, it still looks like the loss of border control. Or two, it's the fact that you still have to abide by the common regulations or laws. But last is in terms of economic sovereignty and currency, that generally limits a lot of your resources as a whole.
Thanks for that speech, Kavip.
Yeah, assuming audible and visible, I'll start in a couple of seconds. Sweet. Okay, cool. The vast majority of you, if not everyone in this room, cannot point out all of these countries on a map. All of you cannot name a singular factoid about the entire region, besides the fact that you potentially watched Borat. The fundamental problem with this op team is that they are not comparative to how these nations are going to develop, given that status quo right now is that they have remained stagnant for decades, and they have already been on the back end when it comes to development and the ability to engage meaningfully with the rest of the international stage. The first thing I want to do in this debate is to evaluate what this bloc is likely going to look like and why this op team doesn't engage with the clear mechanisms that come out from first. First of all, info slide says it's an economic bloc. ASEAN is an economic bloc. Malaysians don't vote in your Philippines politics. So I don't see how Russia is going to have an ability to significantly influence the way that politics occurs within these nations that join, given that there's not going to be a Eurasian parliament where everybody's going to come and engage and you can share political ideas. It's going to be an economic bloc, which likely comes with no taxes or no tariffs on certain trades, or it comes with not needing a visa to be able to travel around freely, or just encouragement of like trade and like specialization wherever necessary, depending on what resources you have and the geography that these countries have. But if Putin's expansionism was a problem, here's why it doesn't work in the way that they claim. Putin is not the USSR. When the USSR wanted to expand, it was on principles of homogeneity, on socialism. So there's no emphasis on making everyone speak Russian, even if they invade your borders right now and force you to conform to their beliefs. There's no emphasis on changing your governmental structure to make sure that everyone is a communist and genociding ethnic groups that might speak out against this simply because they had a history of not supporting socialist causes. Putin's interest lies in Europe, where it's more economically beneficial for him to make infringements over there. This is why he saw like there was conflict in Crimea and why there's conflict in Ukraine right now. If Putin was really interested in securing the old borders of the USSR to the exact replica that it was in the past, he already would have invaded these countries very easily. They have very little political relevance. Nobody is going to send a NATO army to protect them. Like South Asia and India isn't going to band together and come and defend them if Putin chooses to exploit them. Given that Putin already hasn't done this, it's unclear to me why after you decide to chummy up to him in times of his need, he's going to do these things to you. This team needs to explain their incentives, and it's already far too late for them to do so. You cannot trade with other nations within this bloc as meaningfully either because they're a bloc and you're not in the bloc, which means they have benefits and exceptions on tariffs and taxes and the ease of transportation and logistics that you don't have access to. Maybe you can trade with them, but on the margins, it's always going to be better on the outside of the house. They have to contend with the possibility of protectionist mechanisms within this trade organization that you just cannot access. Your analysis was that they have the same goods and the same sort of like produce and the same sort of rare earth minerals. I don't see why they would want to trade with you unless you can contribute back into their economies in a meaningful manner. Let's criticize the counterfactual of how a lack of a trade bloc works for these nations. They say you can trade with China, India, and EU. He pointed out a map in LO, point out a map with some topography. Tibet is not a place where you can transport goods and rare earth minerals through. It's so freaking elevated. There are mountains everywhere. Like my mom took a drive in Tibet like a year ago. It's really terrible. You don't want to be transporting things through. You know what you can transport things through? The Trans-Siberian Railway from Russia to China. Where's the Trans-Siberian Railway? In Russia. The most effective logistical ability for you to do these forms of trade is going to be through Russia. It's through the ports in the north of Russia that you can access these freshwater ports to be able to trade the things that you produce on a global scale anyway. Because geography is a really important thing over here when you have to contend with things like tariffs, that you're passing through multiple countries, you're passing through Afghanistan, through Iran, through Pakistan, through India. To get over there, you're going to be taxed at each and every entry point of every country that you go to. You have to worry about things like storage and security. Guys, harvest produce doesn't stay fresh all the way. I don't know why you want to sell your grain in China, sell your grain in India. I don't know how you're going to get your rare earth minerals, something that you have very little experience in transporting over large distances all the way to China, when these are things that are very importantly sought after. But also China sources their rare earth minerals from Africa. Guess why? Because freshwater ports, something that these countries don't. Unclear why China is going to divest completely from that and come to you instead. But lastly, on the idea of same resources, that's good. It means you can produce more of them in bulk. When you're cooperating, you can merge your infrastructures, you can merge your farms, you can produce more of them more effectively. But even if you can't, having more things to trade means more capital. So you can get more things in return, therefore it's more beneficial for you, like play Catan or something like that. And it's also easier to transport things and develop infrastructure along these lines as well. But thirdly then, on Russia's needs. So now Russia's needs are likely going to help you. You can do things like technology sharing. You can help in the rebuilding of Russia, which is very imminent. The war is likely going to end, or even if it doesn't, some form of ceasefire is likely because of Trump. And he seems to be in favor of Putin, which means that it's likely that Russia is going to get some form of concession in terms of land. Looks like the legitimization of their presence in Crimea, which means, guess what? More freshwater ports or some access to the lands that they want to put in the Donbas region, which is very prominent when it comes to the growth of harvest produce and grain. I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. On the Russian ruble then, Russia is part of BRICS. Russia is no longer attempting to be self-sufficient communist country. They have international trades with everyone. Despite the sanctions that the EU has on them right now, the EU still trades with them for natural gases. There is a global incentive for the ruble to recover because people rely on the ruble to be able to do business. They need the ruble to be at the very least stable and strong. This is why even if the ruble is going to be accepted as a common currency across this union, it's likely going to be a good decision and beneficial to all of the nations involved. But on free labor, you're not going to get Russian laborers coming here and it's stealing your money. They're likely going to be skilled Russian laborers, and these are going to be a labor base that you couldn't provide in the first place. It's more likely that your menial manual laborers are going to go to Russia, get stuff done there, bring the money back in. But also, if that wasn't the case, guys, in a trade bloc, you are only as strong as your weakest partner. If your weakest person in the trade bloc sucks, the entire trade bloc doesn't function as well as it could, which means that's an organic incentive for Russia to ensure that the nations are all working in a sphere of co-prosperity, that everyone is helping each other to develop. This is why the EU pumps billions into Greece, despite being a complete shithole over there, because they know that if every nation is on par in terms of development, in terms of the strength of their currency, this is when you can actually gain the benefits of being in a trade bloc. In our worst case, if Russia chooses to exploit you, a mechanism which is still unproven, you gain significant economic prosperity. They have yet to develop a counterfactual as to how these nations develop beyond being the stagnant shit waters that they are right now.
Thanks for that speech, Opvip.
I'll take POIs through chat.
Opvip.
Yep. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Oh, sorry. Wait. 3, 2, 1. Government so far has glazed Putin and glazed Russia far more than the Lakers have glazed LeBron, and yet they failed to prove a lot of the capacity for this union to be very effective for the countries listed in the info slide. They failed to prove a lot of incentive as to why a lot of the trade that exists within this bloc is something that's going to be balanced and something that actually maximizes the development that they talk about coming from first. Firstly, I want to build an independent argument that was coming from Ilio and Alyssa that talks about sovereignty, because they seemingly ignore a lot of this interest to maintain independence from Russia by simply saying it's an economic bloc, guys. There's no political influence that happens within it. Firstly, consider the context that was already built throughout the round that talks about an interest in upholding sovereignty, not simply because they do not want to politically associate with Russia, but it is precisely because they were also formerly part of the USSR, formerly experienced a lot of the abuse that happened within the region. That also means that they currently do not want to associate with Russia even economically. But secondly, I need you to consider realistically how most trade blocs oftentimes actually function, and oftentimes even these purely economic policies are ones that do tend to compromise levels and extents of sovereignty. Firstly, if they want to cite the info slide as much as they want to do, then consider the many policies that you as a country would have to opt into in this bloc. Firstly, it's the free movement of things like goods and labor that they claim is a good thing, which also requires far less control over your borders, far less control over inflow and outflow of people into your country. Second, it's things like common regulation and undergoing the laws of the bloc, which oftentimes means that you also have to abide by the policies that countries like Russia themselves set. But thirdly, the common currency that they talk about also means that they are far less able to decide on their own as a country the valuation of their currency. They're far less able to defend it, for example, if they want to claim that it's valuable. They're also conversely far less able to actually lower the value of their currency if they want to, for example, increase exports. But secondly, it's to also just consider that Russia obviously has incentives to maintain power within the region, because prior to the Ukraine war, for example, a lot of these regions were also equally unproductive and equally unprofitable for the region. But the reason the bloc still exists is precisely because Russia still has incentives to maintain degrees of soft power over these countries. That's why they want to expand. That's why they want you inside the bloc. And what that means is that it doesn't have to be invasion on our comparative, for example, but it does look like Russia leveraging a lot of trade against you, or Russia leveraging a lot of the labor that they talk about to keep you in the bloc, even if it means compromising more efficient trade partners. The reason the sovereignty argument is important is firstly because we demonstrate that it is independent of a lot of the economic benefits in this debate that thus far have just mostly been demonstrated as a wash from their material. But more importantly, it's precisely because the people within these countries oftentimes hold strong nationalist sentiment, which means the impact on their comparative is one, just far more discontentment on their comparative, but two, an irreversible loss to sovereignty, because even a few months of involvement within this trade bloc is a few months that looks like restructuring your own economy to accommodate far more trade from countries like Russia and Kazakhstan, for example, or just broadly associating a lot more with these countries and affiliating yourself with their policies. But secondly, let's talk a lot more about trade. What we tell you firstly is on their incentive, supposedly, for them to keep the trade bloc functional, because they don't want to, have the weakest link bring them down. The problem here is that incentive might exist on their side. The problem is they never prove capacity, because they themselves also concede that a lot of Russian currency right now isn't just poor, but it is particularly unstable, which means you cannot regulate the currency in ways that are beneficial to these countries. You cannot increase the value of the currency if you, for example, want to maximize import, or you cannot decrease the value of the currency, for example, if you want to maximize export. The problem then is that precisely by entering into this bloc and adopting their common currency, associating with Russia, for example, trades off a lot of this control and trades off a lot of economic efficiency. But secondly, on the common currency, what we demonstrate as a harm isn't necessarily that the ruble is weak, but more precisely that you do not control the weakness of your currency. And the reason this is important is because of the ways in which this country would likely want to manipulate its currency, right? For example, if what they want to say is they want people to spend more, want people to be more productive, then you need to be able to use central banks, for example, to increase the value of this currency instead of being solely dependent on the productivity of the bloc, but on the comparative. If you want to massively sell large amounts of minerals to things like China, for example, you need to be able to lower that currency instead of being dependent on Russia, for example, that is flip-floppy and flimsy. But secondly, on trade, notice how a lot of their examples on what you'll actually be able to trade for are non-existent. The problem is if the countries that you are likely to trade for on their comparative are countries that oftentimes are also incredibly minerally rich, for example, it means that on average, you're just unlikely to even get any trade for the oil and for the minerals that you sell. But two, if you do, it's for cheap, precisely because there's no comparative advantage and there's no demand. But secondly, when it comes to our comparative, when it actually comes to getting trade, they simply dismiss this as you being landlocked. I think that's just fundamentally untrue and unpersuasive. Firstly, China is to your direct east. India is to your direct south. Both of them want your minerals and both of them want your oil. And if you want to question capacity, then presumably there's mass amounts of infrastructure that already connect both countries to the region around you, regions like Russia and regions like Kazakhstan, that enable you to also build roads towards these countries as well, that enable you to actually engage in trade with them. But two, If it is so important that you get trade with the US and the EU, there's a few reasons for why they would also want this as well. The first is that they are currently already expanding towards Central Asia, precisely for the political reasons of wanting to be able to have a democratic ally or an ally in general within Central Asia to check Russia. But secondly, beyond political interest, it's just that the EU right now needs oil. Look at the state of Germany's energy efficiency, for example, or the US needs things like minerals for things like their AI development. But lastly, it's just that they also want to undermine Russia, which means that they're likely to invest significantly into your country, for example, should you choose to trade with them. The difference is that on their side, because you associate with Russia, because you associate with this union, they cut you off. They're less likely to see you as a viable partner. You trade off a lot of the benefits that we list to you down the bench. You do not get anything else on their side. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for that speech. Op reply.
Government loves Putin so much that they have literally become him. They are like Putin in the aspect that they are persistent, but they don't concede, even if, for example, it is unstrategic for their case. There are two things that I want to point out about their case and the reasons why we already win this round. The first and foremost is they are just very unengaging with the main comparative that we offer to them. I think at best, they merely give one-liners or brush off our benefit of economic sovereignty. I want to note that this is the most important issue in the round, insofar as this operates independent of the main economic development clash, which means that if they don't respond to it, means that it still stands at the end of the debate. Let's use their context that a lot of the times these specific countries in Central Asia are underdeveloped. That means that these countries need this economic sovereignty the most to do things like adjust interest rates, to give loans to the poor, as what we said, or input more or less money into the economy in order to boost certain industries, or even just change the value for the best kinds of efficient processes for their specific region. They never respond to the fact that this is severely limited when you do enter into this partnership that is majorly controlled by Russia. At best, they try to say, oh, it's not political, so it's not going to impact the political things that you do within the country. Guys, this neglects the intuition that obviously the economy and the politics of a specific country are severely interlinked. So it looks like, for example, how economies often follow specific and common regulations. You see this in the EU, even if, for example, they are of different countries and they're not a political union in nature. It's a fact that they still have to follow those regulations in the very first place. Or if you're talking about the free goods or movement that you want within this economic union, you have to lose some amount of border control, which limits your capacity as a government to enforce a lot of these protections. But also, if it's like politicians often usually just use the economy as one of their issues as well. So it's just unsure of why this is not linked as well to the end of this debate. But the second point I want to make is just a lot of their benefits are non-exclusive. So let's go on the economic clash and assume that it's still the largest issue within the round. First and foremost was their benefit on trade. We gave you the comparative that we trade with individuals like the EU and like the US. Why is this far better than the comparative they have of the allies of the bloc of Russia, like things like BRICS? The reason why we are just far better is that we are not limited to the meager allies that you have in BRICS, insofar as a lot of those BRICS movements have become controversial or at least as not as influential compared to the EU or US that just have a greater capacity and also have a greater number of allies. So if it is about the number of allies and the scale of like the trade that you're able to do, you're better able to do that with the EU and US. And we told you why that's already likely for the EU and US to invest in you. It's the fact that you have a competitive advantage by being one of the only individuals within Central Asia who have not aligned yourself with Russia. And they try to say that, oh, like what is your competitive advantage to other people if you still have the same amount of minerals or resources? Your competitive advantage is that you're not aligned with Russia, which makes you far more trustful as an ally. And moreover, gives, for example, things like the military advantage or just generally having eyes on these specific the specific region for EU and Russia. But the second is unemployment. So they try to say that you want better return of investment and all these things, but they are unresponsive to a lot of the claims we gave, how a lot of the Russians will try to go to these specific areas and take their jobs. And this is true for the fact that there are things like mass immigration in the very first place, or just even if, for example, it's not true, by means of the economic union in of itself means that they can freely go to these countries as well. And that is severely harmful, especially for the reasons that we have stated, that in the past there have been things like ethnic tensions, and you further other kinds of tensions within your country, like, for example, taking their jobs. And it's worse for the fact that Russians will probably not as input as much into your economy, and that's why it's unsustainable to begin with. The comparative we have in opposition is simple. We make economic development far more sustainable, but we make it that we are far more independent in terms of our economic sovereignty and the trade and employment that we implement in our own country.
Thanks for that speech. Proper reply to conclude the semi-final.
All right, hi. Give me a second to set up and order my speech, and I'll order my notes, and I'll set up my timeline. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Do not let opposition run away with a gross mischaracterization of the debate. I think the biggest downfall of opposition was when they attempted to push to you an idea that these three nations that we talk about are necessarily strong enough to be able to engage in whatever that they talk to you. I think the one important understanding is to understand what is the examples of a middle power, a strong power economy. The reality then, a lot of the argumentations only manifests itself and fully weaponizes itself the moment you're a middle power or strong power. This means the agency to negotiate, the agency to be able to form bilateral trade deals that are meaningful to you can only come into play when you have the cards to negotiate for that position. The reality brought up from first was that these nations don't necessarily have those power, and by virtue of that, it's oftentimes a requirement for powers to hop onto other strategic partners. So no, the idea that EU and the US necessarily cares about you and wants to care about your well-being is inherently a false statement. This isn't true by virtue of what you produce and provide to them. Firstly, you're extremely far from them. You're not proximate. But secondly, what you give back isn't a unique thing that you have. Oftentimes, your alternatives exist, and these alternatives oftentimes exist within this bloc. By virtue of that, it's very clear as to why the debate happens on Gulf more likely than it's on. Comparatives then that really proves why our government wins this debate. First thing I want to note was the ideation around the control of currency coming extremely late within WIP. The reality of how currency is controlled is oftentimes a communal thing. It's a collective. People work together and decide the value of their currencies, and oftentimes are dependent upon free market principles. So it's not true that you lose all autonomy to do so. But the second question then is how much power do you necessarily have to control your currency? Again, this only comes into play when you're a strong or a middle power economy. If you're a low power economy, oftentimes like manipulating your currency doesn't bring any tangible effects. So it's better for you to manipulate when you're a bloc as opposed to that. Fine, doing the comparatives. Let's understand the biggest push coming out from OP and what they hinged their victory on. Was the idea of sovereignty, the idea of anti-Russia and national pride. One very simple question to answer. Those things can be eaten? The answer is oftentimes no. A comparative here is to choose between the prosperity of your people, development of your country, and necessarily to progress in terms of technological advancements, especially noting that you're sandwiched between two superpowers and you're forced to make a decision. Oftentimes, your sovereignty and your national pride, taking Gulf opposition at their best, is intangible. You can't make people's lives better just because they feel they liberated and anti-Russia. This is inherently just untangible. People would rather be able to survive, rather be able to grow and develop, as opposed to just be anti-Russia and principally strong. Therefore then, and to understand the part, what then Gulf's impacts necessarily bring? It's simple, that in the existence of this economic union, there are multiple things that happen. Firstly, the ability of technological transfer oftentimes means that you benefit from this. Economically as well, this means that your economy, like the share of your market, expands beyond just isolated within your bilateral trades and whatever small marginal trades that you have. But lastly, on the human resource improvement, this actually flips the argumentation coming up from opposition, because opposition says that, look, this means that Russian professionals come into your place and steal all your jobs. But that never isn't inherently bad all the time. This also means that your workforce is able to go to Russia, able to go to other states, and also improve themselves, come back and build up your economies and infrastructure. Movement of labor isn't always bad. Do not buy this argumentation. The reality is that sometimes it does benefit. This is not true that necessarily you lose everything. Lastly, is Russia a malicious actor? Yes. But is Putin necessarily an Indian? No, that's just simple. That prosperity can only come in the place where everyone prospers together. If the currency tanks because of one lagging actor, that means that Russia suffers as well. And obviously Putin doesn't want to suffer. By virtue of that, you make sure that all your members are great. That means your welfare is taken care of.
Thanks for that speech, and everybody for what was a fine debate. You'll get to know the call of this round, I think, in announcements afterwards. So thanks so much for the semi-final and good luck.